Hey everybody, this is Aaron from Aaron's Audio Corner, and today we're going to shake it up a little bit, kind of like the cars do. I posted a couple days ago, I suppose, a poll asking I've got this JBL set of speakers, the A120 and the A130. Do you want to see me do a review on just those two? Or since I didn't really like either the JBL speakers, would you rather see me do a review comparing and contrasting not just these two, but also against the Emotiva, what is this, the Aeromotive B1 Plus? The reason for that is because current MSRP, now these things go on sale, so I'm just quoting current MSRP for the Stage A120 from JBL is about 200 bucks, and the Stage A130 from JBL is about 300 bucks. The Emotiva falls right smack dab in the middle, which ironically, so does its size. The A130 features a 5.25 inch midwoofer mid range, and then the A120 features I think it's a 4 inch midwoofer mid range. Whereas the Emotiva B1 Plus features a 5.25 inch mid range midwoofer as well. So these two are more closely aligned, but again, the price for each of these, this guy falls kind of smack dab in the middle of those. And I thought, what better way to approach a review, one that's going to be kind of, I mean, honestly, if I just reviewed these two JBLs, it would be an overall negative review. Rather than just telling you that I wasn't too fond of and explaining why, I thought I would give you something to compare against. And in that case, it is going to be the Emotiva speaker. So while I've got your attention, let's go ahead and look at a few things. Number one, waveguide on the JBLs. Cool. The Emotiva has a folded ribbon tweeter. I think that's what they're calling it. Now, there's different versions of ribbon tweeters, and this one may be a little bit different. It may be an AMT. Honestly, I don't really get into that because some people will dig into the minutia of that branding, but it doesn't really matter when you're spending 250 bucks. You're probably not too worried about the specific part as long as it performs well and is worth the money. And in this case, the Emotiva does and is. All of these come with grills. The Emotiva that I've already reviewed, and I'll throw it up in the corner up here if you want to go back and check the full review, is magnetic. You can just pop them on there, and that's about it. Whereas the JBLs have little pins, and I got to be honest, they're pretty hard, relatively speaking. They're pretty hard to remove. Some of you may or may not like that. I mean, I think it's a good sign that it's going to stay in place, so you don't have to worry about it just randomly falling out because it wasn't machined to the correct size for the holes. That's a good thing. But yeah, it's a little bit tough to remove. And then on the back side, you've got a lot of plastic. I don't even honestly recall if I measured with the grills on for these speakers. And if I didn't, then you'll have to forgive me. But there's a lot of things I've got going on at this time. And I've really got to be selective about the ventures and the rabbit holes that I go down. So, yeah, like I said, you have to forgive me for that one. So let me spin the A120 around. And what you'll notice is there is a port bung back here. Now, the A130 does not come with a port bung, so you cannot seal it, at least from what the factory provides you. You could stuff a sock in there if you wanted to. I think I've done that. I've actually, even when I measured the A130, I took this port bung and I put it into the A130's back so I could also measure it sealed. But I do want to point out and make sure that you all understand that when I show you the measurements for the sealed performance of the A130, you're going to have to do your own little finicking there and throw a sock in there or throw a towel in there to stuff the port if you want to go that route. Let's set this guy to the side. And now we've got the Stage A130. And as you can see, it's pretty much the same thing. It's just scaled up. Not really a lot to see there in that regard. And on the back side, the Emotiva is ported as well. I believe that the Emotiva does come with a port bung, but memory evades me right now. So maybe we'll discuss that in a little bit. But I think it does come with a port bung. So you do have the option of porting it or using it in a sealed configuration with that port bung. And I go ahead and give you the highs and lows, no pun intended. The JBLs just didn't impress me. I was honestly expecting more. Audio Science Review reviewed the A130, and I had high expectations for it based off of that review. The owner of these speakers actually ordered them from a retailer and had them drop shipped to me directly. So they were all brand new. And of course, I did break them in sufficiently. I mean, whatever you want to call break in, but they were played for plenty of time before I actually confirmed the results with the testing. Having said that, my results were different for the A130, and I did do some additional outdoor ground plane and quasi-anechoic measurements to confirm that my A130 measurements are real, and indeed they do not match ASR's results. Both of these speakers, JBLs, have a bit of a bump in the mid bass. Depending on which one you're looking at, it's between about 100 to 150 hertz, and it's about maybe 2, maybe 3 dB or so over the average of the mean SPL, which is between like 300 hertz and 3 kilohertz. There's a trough on both speakers right through the mid range. And then when you get to the higher frequencies, it just takes off. And actually, both speakers do have some internal cabinet resonance from the sides and from the tops. And it gives it that Batman looking look where you start off with a boosted low end, you go up, you got a port resonance or a cabinet wall resonance, I should say, peaking around the 1 kilohertz area. And then it goes back up again through the treble. I didn't like that. I did not like the speakers. And I mean, honestly, if it were my money, I'd go with the Emo. And that's exactly why I'm reviewing the Emo, to tell you, explain to you why that's the case. Now, the Emo is a more neutral speaker. It's not perfect, but I think bang for buck, it currently is probably one of the better ones for the value, I would say. It's not, again, it's not perfect, but for $250, you get a really good speaker that has decent output. It's not super low. You also have good neutrality through the mid-range and through the tweeter area. There is a little bit of some deviance there, and we'll talk about that in the data. And again, if you want to look at my other review in more depth, you can do that. But for now, let's go ahead and kick this off, and we'll take a quick look at some of the data. I'm not going to highlight all of it because I don't want this video to run any longer than it has to. I got to try to keep your attention so you understand why I am doing this comparison. We're going to start off with the data on the Emotiva Aeromotive B1 Plus. Now, this is a Spinorama data. And at first glance, this data looks really good. The linearity is reasonably well. The thing that does stand out, and when you start to kind of dig into it a little bit more, is that the mid-range is slightly recessed, maybe like a dB or so compared to the high frequency. And you do have some cabinet resonance going on right between the 1 to 2 kilohertz region. I know that that's cabinet resonance because I slapped an accelerometer on the side of the speaker, swept it, and yeah, sure enough, it's some resonance at the side of the enclosure and at the top. Now, I don't know necessarily what's causing that, but for all intents and purposes, it really doesn't matter. When you pay for the speaker, unless you want to modify it, you're going to listen to it as is. So I do want to point this kind of thing out. Now, the cool thing about it is that when you go down here and look at the directivity index, you can see that both in the early reflections and in the sound power directivity index, the response curve is actually quite smooth. So that means that you could pretty efficiently equalize out this little region. I mean, really, you could probably take one EQ filter, one parametric EQ filter, center at about maybe 1.3 kilohertz, maybe put it about Q of 2. I'm just kind of guessing here, and drop it down about 2 dB, and that would bring that level down a little bit. But do you need to do that? I don't necessarily know. In my previous review, which again I spoke about in another video, I noted where another listener made the comment that it sounded a little bit shouty to him. I came up with, this is probably the resonance from the cabinet structure. He said, again, a little bit shouty. I found it slightly offensive. And I mean, I had to listen for it. And when I did EQ it, it made the sound a little bit better. I don't know that everybody's going to pick up on it right away, but I think if you have the ability to A/B it with an equalization in place, then you're going to notice that. But again, at the price, I'm okay with this being where it is and as low in amplitude as it is. The only real problem is that it's spread out over a wide octave range. Going up into the high frequencies, you get a little bit of a boost relative again to the mid range. But I think, I keep saying for the price, I'm okay with this. Looking at the directivity index, it's reasonably well managed as you hand off from the mid range mid-woofer to the tweeter, both in early reflections and the sound power. The sound power only suffers a little bit. So overall, I'd say that's pretty darn good. Now let's look at the JBL Stage A120. Ooh-wee. Complete departure from the Aeromotive. Look at this. You see this bump right through here? See this pretty strong resonance right through here? Now you also get some peaks and dips in the directivity index. Now, some of that you may be able to equalize out, but when you have these kind of variations going on back to back, it means it's going to be a little bit harder to equalize because the direct sound is going to still sound different than your off-axis sound. So keep that in mind when you're shopping this speaker. The overall level of the tweeter and upper mid-range is at about, man, it's almost 3 to 4 dB higher than the mid-range scoop right through here. And then you've got that nice punchy bass that some people love. Honestly, I thought this speaker was pretty bad. When I stuffed the port, it sounded better because it kind of solved this peaky response right here, but you still have a bump up in the overall treble. Some people may call that detailed. I call that hogwash. I personally don't like it, but if you do like it, then hey, more power to you. Now that you've seen the data, you have an understanding of what you've heard or what you might be hearing should you purchase this speaker or already own it. Now we're going to jump to the A130. Now the A130 looks better. It's not perfect. And I'm going to note once again that this result is different than the results from ASR. Now, the conclusion that some people are coming up with is that JBL has possibly made a change to the design since the time that ASR reviewed the speaker. That may be very true. I simply don't know. I only know what I was provided, and this speaker was brand new in box from a retailer and properly broken in, so no concerns there about the quality of the speaker in relation to the results from the other website. Again, we see a little bit of a bump through this low bass region, a dip in the mid-range, peaking again in between the 800 hertz to about 1.6, 1.7 kilohertz region. More than likely, it's cabinet resonance, I would assume, especially given that it's so far wide. Why do I say that? Because normally what you have is you have tangential, axial modes, and oblique modes. So you have different modal issues going on inside the enclosure, and they excite the panels a little bit differently. So you can measure with an accelerometer the top of the panel and get a completely different result with an accelerometer measured at the side of the panel. Now, I did both of those cases to see what I got, and indeed, I did get different results. They lined up pretty well with these peaks right through here, and you can go view that data on my website if you want to later. You've got a recess through the treble relative to this peaky business in the mid-range area right there. And then you've got a bump in output at around 10 kilohertz of about plus 5 dB over the mean. It's just to me, a really not a good sounding speaker. I think that's really the easiest way to put it. The directivity, it's reasonable. It's really not bad. What we see here is it's narrowing up as you go higher in frequency and you're getting closer to the tweeter. And then when the tweeter comes in, you actually get pretty wide and you'll stay pretty constant. And the reason I say pretty constant is because this line is no longer trending upward. It's going flat. So once the directivity index line goes flat, that means the radiation sound or the sound of radiation is going to be more constant. So if it's plus or minus 60 degrees, it stays that way throughout the mid-range. Let's quickly look at the estimated in-room response. Taken at about 2 meters out, we see a mild slope down in response, but again, that little peaky business of around the 1 to 2 kilohertz area is kind of rearing its head. And this being flat, I think kind of lends itself to some of the magic that other reviewers have heard with this speaker. I didn't think the tweeter was bad. I didn't think it was great by, I won't say by a long shot. I thought it sounded good. And keeping in mind the price that you're paying, I think it's an excellent value overall. And the highs sounded nice to me. And actually, I can say that normally I would say, looking at this specific graphic, that the sound is probably going to sound a little bit bright to me. But I think relative to this 1 kilohertz area, that makes it sound not so bright. And that's the thing about when you're listening to these speakers. It's all relative, because unless you have perfect pitch, you're probably got relative pitch. So mentally, you're kind of comparing sounds against other sounds. And that's certainly how I hear. If you have perfect pitch, then, man, you're pretty awesome, but I do not. Now we're going to look at the Stage A120. And again, we got this Batman thing going on here. Batman. So we can see the bump in the low region, peaking right here, and then it kind of swing back up. And now we're going to look at the A130. So the A130 is very similar. It's got the Batman thing. Look, here's his noggin, and here's his little bat ears. Maybe he slept upside down and squished the bat ears a little bit because they're squared off. And then you've got a little bit of it's more of a flat plateau through here, and then a peaking as you go higher in frequency. And that's really what I heard. I just heard a boomy sound, very forward, with a lot of high frequency content that I just did not care for, both on the A130 and the A120. Now let's look at the horizontal radiation pattern. This is the bird's eye view looking top down from the speaker. And we can see that the directivity of the speaker, following kind of the red lines here, is about plus or minus 70 in the low frequency to the mid-range area. And then you've got a dip at about the crossover region, so around 1.3 to 2 kilohertz. And then it gets wide again at about plus or minus 60 degrees. So it's not perfect, but again, I have seen worse. The A120 speaker is, man, that's an interesting speaker. Now, the mid range is more narrow in sound, and really it's not so much that it's narrow, it's just that it's lower in amplitude. So if you can kind of mentally draw the lines through here, you're going to have a wider window of sound. It looks like, if I go back to the emo, actually, no, maybe not. The emo might be wider. Yeah, at some frequency. So that's really interesting radiation pattern. Let's go to A130. Now, the A130 is a little bit more neutral, so you see more red filling in the mid-range, and it's more of a constant directivity than maybe the other two speakers. But whether you like that sound or not, that really gets into preference. When you're talking about constant directivity, and when I say constant, I guess I should point out that I'm talking about a radiation pattern that is the exact same from, let's say, 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. That's not going to be realistic, but it would keep its radiation pattern window all the way through, right? Whereas a controlled directivity pattern, I would call it, it can get narrow, but it's getting narrow smoothly. You know, you're not jumping all around like you would with maybe the clip speakers that I've tested in the past. And I like that when it's smooth, certainly because you don't have any soundstage artifacts going on. And what I mean by that? Well, I mean, if you have one frequency that is plus or minus 90 degrees wide, and then 3 or 4 octaves up, you've got another frequency that is plus or minus 30 degrees wide. Well, if there's any harmonics from one of those instruments that carries over to the higher frequency, that can cause some soundstage drift. And this is my opinion. This is not proven in science, but it seems to make sense to me based on some blind testing that I did earlier this year against a couple different speaker types. I've kind of honed in on that. Maybe I'm biased on my own conclusions. It's a hypothesis at this point, but I like to think it makes sense. If you don't, that's fine too. You can just view the data in your own way. Now we're looking at the distortion artifacts from the speaker. This is at 96 dB at 1 meter. And for what it's worth, a lot of people think that, oh, that's way too loud, but more than likely you're going to be listening to these further away. And for each doubling of distance, you're losing about 6 dB. Now, the room certainly helps you get some extra energy. So it could be anywhere from 3 to 6 dB decrease in SPL. But the purpose of the 96 dB is kind of like a stress test to see, okay, can it handle louder volumes, or can it handle, dynamic swings of that nature? Overall, you're within about 3% THD on the Emotiva. You're a little bit higher than 3% on the low end of the A120. And then on the A130, it actually looks better than the Emo, if I go back, but not significantly better. And actually, the distortion is a little bit higher in the higher frequencies than with the Emotiva. So, I might kind of call that a draw. I don't really get into the artifacts of distortion too much. I just look at them as pointers and cues. The last thing I'm going to talk about is dynamic range of the speaker. So I test it at 76 dB and then 86 dB, 96 and 102 dB. And I compare the 3 ladders to the former. So I compare 86, 96, 102 to 70 dB, 76 dB. And as I make those adjustments in volume, I want to know, has the frequency response changed? Because it certainly can. We know that with pro audio monitors, such as the Callies that I recently tested, there's built-in limiting to speakers. But with passive speakers, there's not built-in limiting, but the components sometimes just heat up so much, like the voice coil or the resistors, and other components within the speaker can heat up and cause you to lose output. So that's called compression. Now, enhancement would be if you have a large amount of distortion that sounds louder to you. And that kind of goes back to when people talk about distortion makes things sound louder, but maybe that's a different topic for another day where I can get more of an expert to discuss that fact. Let's look at what we got here. So at 96 dB, it's pretty reasonable, but on the low end, yeah, you drop like a brick. 102 dB, maybe just don't turn the speaker up that loud. Even if you put a crossover on it, you're still going to have this dip right through here. Whether or not you're going to hear it, I can't say. 102 dB in the near field is way too loud. But if you're playing these speakers as surround speakers in a home theater, or they're pretty far away from you in a bedroom or something of that nature, keep this in mind that they are output limited to some degree. Now, this really isn't as bad as, maybe you would think because of its size. It's a 5.25 inch midwoofer. So, okay, I'm all right with that, I guess. The 120 actually does look a little bit worse through the mid-range, But again, it's really just when you get into the 102 dB region. And then the 130, you know, I wasn't expecting to see that. So I'm gonna go compare the 130 to the Emo. Yeah, the Emo is worse, it looks like, on all accounts. Whereas in the higher frequencies, the JBL is better. You know, if you're concerned with just output capability, then maybe the JBL wins. But keep in mind that the JBL is actually less linear in response than the Emo. So if you made equalization adjustments to the JBL, you'd probably wind up with similar results that you got as to the Emotiva. So that's just one of those things also to keep in mind when you're evaluating the data, and questions to ask yourself along. With that said, I am out of here. I am done, and I truly hope you learned something. If you are not subscribed, I would really appreciate it if you would subscribe, because that helps me out and helps me grow this channel and helps me be able to do more of this kind of stuff. And I've got a Patreon if you're interested in that. The link will be in the description below. If not, that's cool too. I will talk to y'all later. Take care. Peace.